morning. I'm Dr. Susan Holman, and I'm going to talk to you about the neurobiology of addiction. The main take-home message here is that addiction is a primary neurologic disease, and that's important. Neurologic just means brain and spinal cord, okay, nervous system. Primary means it's not caused by something else, and that's really important because most people come to treatment because they're convinced that their ADD or their depression or their anxiety caused them to self-medicate, in quotes. And in fact, it gets quite confusing when people get here because they frequently come in with a lot of different diagnoses: bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, depression. And part of our job is to try to figure out what's primary and what's secondary. Now, by that I mean, if you've got depression and you don't drink alcohol, that's a primary disorder. But if you get depressed after you've been drinking alcohol, then that's a substance-induced or a secondary disorder. And so an awful lot of folks come into Pavilion with a lot of different diagnoses, and one of our main jobs is to try to figure out, is it a substance-induced disorder or do you have two different primary disorders? And by that I mean the disease of addiction, which is a primary disorder, and the disease of, say, depression or anxiety is a second primary disorder. And one of the ways we try to figure that out is when people first come in, we give them Beck or Zung anxiety and depression scales, and that's a short 2-page questionnaire, and it gives you a number score. And so we plot these numbers out. So when people first come in, their scores are usually pretty high because you don't come to a place like this because life's great and you're having a good day, right? So scores are high, but we repeat those tests about every 24 to 48 every 5 to 7 days, and then we see what the numbers do. So if a person's numbers do that, meaning the numbers get better as time goes on, this person has a substance-induced disorder, right? Because the longer the brain is away from the chemical causing it, as in alcohol as a depressant, the better the depression gets. Now, if on those scores that looks like they're plotted out and the scores stay about the same, then that person probably has two primary disorders, meaning the disease of addiction, which is a primary disorder, and another primary disease, which is depression, okay? And I'll talk more about the time sequence to figure this out in a few minutes. But needless to say, addiction is a primary neurologic disorder. It's not caused by anxiety, ADD, bad parenting, stress. It's a primary disorder in and of itself. And at its essence, it's a dopamine deficiency. Dopamine is a messenger chemical in the brain. There's another disease that is a dopamine deficiency that's a primary neurologic disorder, and that's Parkinson's disease. Most of y'all have heard of that. Michael J. Fox is their spokesperson. That's also a dopamine deficiency, but it's in a different part of the brain, so it gives you different symptoms. One is, Parkinson's is in a movement part of the brain. Addiction is in the reward pathway, which is a more primitive, primal part of the brain. So symptoms are different, but they're both primary disorders, basically a dopamine deficiency. Okay, so in this country, 85 to 90% of people try alcohol or drugs at any one time, but only 10 to 12% of people develop this disease or blossom with the disease of addiction. And the question is, why just that 10 to 12%? I have two brothers who don't have this disease, and I used to think, why did I get the short end of the stick? Well, I don't feel that way anymore because I don't feel like I got the short end of the stick. I feel like the lucky one, actually. But you can look at my brothers and me and tell a difference genetically. I mean, you can tell we got a different slice of the gene pool. My two brothers have got brown hair and brown eyes like my mother, and I've got blue eyes and used to have blonde hair before it went gray, and that's more like my father's side of the family. And I had to do some digging to find it in his family, but it's there. That's where the alcoholism comes from. And so that speaks to obvious genetic differences and then where the genes of the disease came from. You can look on the NIDA, that's NIDA website, and find the incidence of alcoholism for any different population or culture, race. And there's a broad variation. The low end of the spectrum would be the Asian population, a small subsegment of the Asian population where the incidence of alcoholism is only like 1 to 3%. The other end of that spectrum would be the Native American population where the incidence of alcoholism can be as high as 60 to 70%, and that's pretty dramatic. So we're actually sort of on the low end of that at 10 to 12%. And that number's been fairly consistent over the last 20 or 30 years. We now know that the small subsegment of the Asian population that has such a low incidence of alcoholism, those folks are born without one of the enzymes that breaks alcohol down. And it's the same enzyme that antabuse blocks. Antabuse, as you probably remember, is that old-fashioned drug that people used to use to treat alcoholism. And it does no such thing. All it does is make you very, very sick if you drink while you're taking it. So anyway, these folks who are born without this enzyme, they get a buildup. Alcohol breakdown can't go all the way through, and they get a buildup of one of the middle products of alcohol breakdown called acetaldehyde. And that is very, very toxic. So those folks, when those folks have their first drink, they get violently ill. Blood pressure goes way up, projectile vomiting, skin turns red. It's a dramatic reaction. And it's like putting your hand on a hot stove. You only do that once if you can help it. And that's why their incidence of alcoholism is so low. Now, I suspect what they're going to find with the Native American population is that their brains process alcohol differently. They probably can metabolize it faster, meaning they have more tolerance before they start staggering around or black out. And they probably also have more involvement of their dopaminergic and endorphin system. And what that means is that they get more euphoria. They feel better from any given amount of alcohol. It's more reinforcing. So, and then if you look on the NIDA website, you can see the incidence for all populations in between there, because there's such a broad range over the planet, basically. You know, years ago, when the medical community was beginning to look at this as a disease as opposed to just a weakness, they started looking at family studies to try to see if this truly was a genetic issue. And you know, as a matter of fact, you can look as far back as Aristotle, our first doctors, and see things like drunks beget more drunks. So it's clear even from early on that this tended to run in families. Early medical studies, the first ones were family studies, and they looked at families and found that sons of alcoholics are 4 times more likely than the general population to be alcoholic. And then they looked at twin studies, and there's 2 types of twins. There's identical twins, which are called monozygotic, 1 egg, 1 sperm, splits in half, and those kids are almost clones. That's why they're identical, but they're almost clones because it's just a split of the DNA. Non-identical twins, fraternal twins, are dizygotic, 2 eggs, 2 sperm. And so they are more like brother and sister. They're frequently not the same sex. They usually don't look a bit alike. So again, one set are almost clones, and the other set have very, very different DNA. So the study they did involved looking at twins, whether they were raised together or separately, and trying to figure out if one's alcoholic, how often is the other one going to be alcoholic as well? And that's called a concordance rate. And what they found is with identical twins, 70 to 80% of the time, if one's alcoholic, they're both alcoholic. Whereas with non-identical twins, it's only 20 to 30% of the time, maybe as high as 35% of the time. And again, that's even if they're not raised together. And that definitely also speaks to the idea that genes are very important in this disease. This is a genetically linked disease, okay? Now, one other study that I think is really important for folks to understand had to do with what causes the addiction. Is it something that happens to you in childhood, or you're born with this disease? And so they did adoption studies, and they looked at 2 groups of kids. They had babies that were adopted at birth, and one set were babies with a family history of alcoholism, and they were adopted into non-alcoholic families, you know, very stable, sort of Leave It to Beaver type situation, not a lot of chaos going on. The other group of kids were babies without a family history of alcoholism, but they were adopted into chaotic alcoholic households. And they followed all of these kids out for a minimum of 30 years. And what they found is that the kids with a family history of alcoholism, but raised in these very nice, quiet, stable little families, were still 4 times more likely to be alcoholic than the general population. Whereas the kids with no family history of alcoholism, but raised in these chaotic, sometimes traumatic environments as children, were no more likely to be alcoholic than the general population. And that's important because what that means is that bad parenting does not cause alcoholism. And you can't out-parent a genetic alcoholic. You know, you can be the best parent you can be, but if your child is genetically predisposed to this disease, and they're one of those 85 to 90% of people in this country that tries alcohol or drugs, it's probably going to happen. There's nothing that says it's going to happen now versus later. It's not that specific. But again, good parenting won't get rid of it, and bad parenting doesn't cause it. Now, when I give this lecture and there are counselors in the room, they all begin to get a little antsy and twitch a little bit when I say that, because for a long time the thought has been that this is more nurture than nature. And this lecture is really just about the smallest, the tiniest essence of addiction. Your childhood, the traumas, the stresses that you've had do make a difference, but you cannot create an alcoholic in somebody who is not genetically predisposed. Okay? If you're genetically predisposed and you throw in these other variables, then it's more likely to happen at any given time. But you cannot create an alcoholic by stressing a child. Okay? That makes sense so far? Okay. I go to a lot of meetings and I hear people say in meetings sometimes, you know, I think I was born an alcoholic. And I used to think that was odd. How could you be born an alcoholic? I understand that more now, and one of the studies that I think helps to explain that sentiment that people have had to do with EEGs in young adults who were either family history positive or negative for alcoholism. And these were young adults who, again, had never had a drink or a drug. And they again, divide them into two groups: family history positive for alcoholism, family history negative. And you know, EEGs are brainwave studies. They do them with sleep studies, seizure studies, that sort of thing. So when they looked at the results of this, what they found is that in the family history positive group, there was a very high incidence, a statistically significant incidence of abnormalities in two specific areas on the EEG, and they were consistent person to person, basically. And that's in the family history positive group. The family history negative group did not have these abnormalities at all. And so that's important, because what that means is that you drink the way you do because your brain is different. Your brain is different from the get-go, right out of the chute. You don't drink too much and cause yourself to sort of step over a line or cause a change in your brain and give yourself alcoholism. Your brain is different before you ever had the first drink or drug. And I want to also go over the fact that, again, this is a research tool. Not every single person in the family history positive group had these abnormalities, but there was a high enough incidence that it was statistically significant. And all that Dr. Mumbo Jumbo to say that what that means is that you can't take your spouse or your other children or your cousins in and have them all get EEGs and find out who's going to be the alcoholic and who isn't, because not every single person had it. And there wouldn't be any point in that anyway, because you can't fix it even if you know about it earlier. All you can do is educate. You can't give them a pill to stop it or put them in jail so they don't drink. You've just got to educate and then step back. You with me so far? Okay, good. Now, some other studies that they did, that they were trying to determine if people do process alcohol differently based on family histories. So again, they took alcohol-naive young adults, never had a drink or a drug, and had the two groups, family history positive and family history negative for alcoholism. And the first thing they did was they looked at the positive effects of alcohol. How good does it make you feel? How much euphoria? How much of a buzz? Whatever terminology sounds familiar to you. And as a recovering person myself, I'll tell you that I know what the answer to that was. I'm not sure why they spent so much money trying to figure that out, because I know what I was doing and where I was standing when I first had my primary drug. And I'm trying to train myself to say primary drug, because I think drug of choice is a really bad term. Nobody chooses to be an alcoholic. It's a nightmare. So primary drug is what I'm trying to go with. Anyway, I know what I was doing and where I was standing when I first had my primary drug, because, you know, I grew up in a neighborhood full of little kids. We were all about the same age. We all ran around, played together. But for my whole life, I felt different. And in that neighborhood growing up, I just thought there's something wrong with me, but I can't quite put my finger on what it is. I look like the other kids, I play like the other kids, but something just didn't feel right. But when I took that medication that later became my primary drug, I knew that fixed whatever had been wrong with me. Because when I took that medication, I had a sense of well-being, or a sense of normalcy, if you will, that I had never had. I knew that I had just figured out the secret to my life. So it's a dramatic experience, and that is in fact what the study showed. The family history positive people did report a lot more, a dramatic amount more euphoria than the family history negative people. And you know, if you ask your loved one who's here, or somebody else who has this disease, what was it like for you when you first had your primary drug or drink? Do you remember what that was like? And they'll look up in the air, and their mouth will open, and they'll start gasping for words, trying to describe the experience, because it is a life-changing situation, because what's happening is that substance is replacing something in your brain that you were born without enough of. Whereas if you're not predisposed to this disease, you already have enough of the substance. So having a drink or two may make you feel a little giddy, and you may feel a little bit more relaxed at a party, and might be a little bit of a pleasant sensation. But for most people who aren't predisposed to this disease, they'll say, well, I can take it or leave it. It's just not that big a deal. Now, if you ask somebody who's predisposed to this disease or has this disease, what was it like, they're going to tell you basically what I've said, which is, whoa, this was a life-changing experience, and I want more, because now I feel like I think everybody else feels, right? So, okay, the other side of this study was looking at the negative effects of alcohol, how much body sway, how much nausea. They did some cognitive testing, problem solving, and they did some hand-eye coordination, and they even did some driving tests. And again, as a recovering person, not a doctor, I could tell you that's another duh. I could tell you what that's going to be, because we are the ones who in high school and college are drinking everybody else under the table. Everybody else is acting like a fool, either dancing on the table or they're passed out. We're picking them up, putting them in the car, and taking them home because they can't handle their booze. And then we're going out looking for more, because we're not done yet. And in fact, what they found in this study is that with the family history negative people, they had more nausea, more body sway. They couldn't drive as well. They couldn't solve problems as well. And obviously what that means is the family history positive people did much better on all of that. And that's really a curse. That's bad news, because what that means is that our warning systems are broken. Most folks, when they've had a few too many, will start slurring their speech or staggering around, and they go, whoa, I've had too much, I've got to stop. And that's the normal response. Most of us don't get that response. Our red lights don't flash and the red flags don't wave until a lot later. We just are not aware of how much we've had, so that's a bad situation. Okay, now moving on, I'm gonna jump around to a lot of different topics, and then I promise I'm gonna bring this all together. The next thing I want to talk about is DNA, genes, because we need to understand this to make sure you understand the basics of this disease. I think everybody who's been through high school biology knows what genes are. DNA is a strand of amino acids, which are proteins, and you get half from mom, half from dad, and they code for everything about you, from your hair color, skin color, eye color, to whether you're a good sleeper, not a good sleeper, to whether you've got the kind of metabolism where you can eat a whole chocolate cake and not gain a pound, or like me, you can look at chocolate cake and gain a pound. All of that is determined by the proteins that your DNA from mom and dad gave you. So the DNA determines how much of each protein and when it's used and how often, that sort of thing. But with this disease, we're talking specifically about messenger chemicals in the brain, because in the brain, the nerves don't touch. There's not one long nerve that goes from your fingertips, say when you touch the hot stove, there's not one long nerve that goes from your fingertip into the brain center. There's a series of junctions called synapses, which look like this, and there's an empty space between them. So you have to have a messenger chemical to pass the message from one nerve to the next. For instance, let me give you an example. Say it's been raining for a couple of weeks, yucky weather, and you walk outside one morning and it's this gorgeous fall day. So you walk outside and you go, wow, nice day. And you just experience, the momentary pleasure, sort of the essence of fall, which, as we all know, is really nice. The way you experience that is when you walk outside and all your senses sort of come alive, a message goes up into a primitive part of your brain called the reward pathway, okay? It goes up into the reward pathway. It hits these little sacs of dopamine. Dopamine, as I mentioned before, is the primary pleasure reward chemical. Hits the sacs of dopamine, moves it to the outside of the nerve and into this empty space between nerves. Okay, it's picked up, this is called a synapse, the empty space, picked up by these little transporter molecules, and then it's moved over to the next nerve and into these receptors, which I always think about as almost like electrical outlets. Once they plug in, the switch is essentially flipped and the message is passed, and you go, wow, nice day, okay? Now, if your DNA, if a normal amount of dopamine is this much, but your DNA only coded for this much, then you're going to walk outside on that glorious day and not even notice it. You're just going to keep moving because you don't have the chemical ability to to have that experience. Does that make sense? Because if you don't have enough dopamine, there's no way that chemically you can have that same experience. Now, again, as I said earlier, addiction is a primary neurologic disease, and it is at its essence a dopamine deficiency. Dopamine is one of the big four in addiction. We're going to talk about four main neurotransmitters. There's a lot more, and this is an oversimplification of some really complicated brain chemistry. But the ones we're going to talk about are dopamine, which I've mentioned, serotonin, which everybody's heard of. It has to do with mood, appetite, circadian rhythm, sort of your sense of yourself, self-perception. GABA, which stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid, and that's the primary sedating or anti-anxiety neurotransmitter. And then endorphins. Endo means within, orphine means morphine, so that's your homemade painkiller. And we all know people who don't have enough of that, right? We call them weenies. They're not really weenies, they're just people who were born without enough endorphins, so they don't have the chemical ability to tolerate pain the way the rest of us do. They do have to have more help with their pain, okay? So those are the main four neurotransmitters. As I said, there's a lot more, and there's one other one I want to mention, and that is corticotropin releasing factor. CRF is a protein hormone that manages the whole stress response system in your body. And stress can be physical stress like a burn or pneumonia or any illness or an accident, or it can be emotional stress like divorce, a death, lose your job, anything like that. But CRF is responsible for that whole system. And one of the things that we now know is that this CRF system is defunct or damaged in one way or another, is not right, in everybody with this disease, almost. And most of you probably know that because we don't handle stress very well. And if you're family members, you realize that because you see your loved ones not doing very well with stress. They respond a lot more than other people do. I don't tolerate stress nearly as well as my middle brother does. So that's a fairly well-known fact. And again, as I mentioned, there's other neurotransmitters, but these are the main ones. And for the sake of understanding, I think that's as far as we should go with those. So here's the deal. If you're born with not enough of one or more of these neurotransmitters, then you're going to be walking around on the planet with this sense of unease. Dis-ease is sort of the cliche in 12-step programs. You have to have the right combination of neurotransmitters to feel normal, whatever that is, because I'm not sure I would ever know that. But so if you don't have the right combination, then something's you're going to feel just not quite right all of your life. And you're going to be looking for something to make you better, to make you feel what you think is normal. And you're probably going to find the answer in a drug of abuse, okay? So one of the things that I feel really strongly about, as do most people who work in this field, is that we need to rename this disease. Instead of saying you're an alcoholic or you're a crackhead or you're just a drug addict, call it RDS, and that stands for Reward Deficiency Syndrome, because it's in the reward pathway, which is a specific part of the brain I'm going to show you in a minute. It is a disease of a deficiency because you don't have enough of one or more of these neurotransmitters, and syndrome just means group of symptoms. But I think if we can destigmatize or normalize this disease, that a lot more people would survive it, because, you know, the statistics of this disease are terrible. More people die of this disease than survive it. A lot more people. I mean, it's terrible, terrible statistics. And I'm convinced that a large part of that has to do with shame and what we've done to ourselves in this society, because we think it's a bad thing or a dirty thing. You know, close your eyes, and what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you say the word alcoholic? I'll tell you, for me, no matter how many times I give this lecture and how long I've been in recovery, what always pops onto my screen is somebody crawling out from under a bridge in a dirty trench coat with a dirty paper bag in their hand and a bottle in it. You know, scraggly hair, not an unclean person. And you know, the truth of the matter is that some homeless people do have this disease, but by and large it looks like me. I mean, it looks like most of the population. It doesn't look different or dirty. But that's what most of us think of ourselves, and that delays people getting to treatment a lot, because when you just think you're bad or dirty, you don't want anybody to know it. So you keep running around trying to fix it yourself and trying to do something about it, and you just get more and more ashamed of yourself, and that tends to produce more and more anxiety and anger and all sorts of emotions that aren't very pretty. I'll tell you, for me, in the last of my months during my addiction, had this mental image of myself as this little animal that's running from rock to rock trying to hide from people and stay in the shadows, because I didn't want anybody to learn this horrible secret I had, because I just felt like I was the lowest form of life on earth. You know, scum practically, because I felt like, you know, for gosh sakes, I'm a doctor, I should know better. And I did know better, but it didn't have anything to do with knowing. I could not figure out how not to do the things I kept doing, how not to swallow the pills and alcohol that I kept going after and needing. And I kept thinking, I'm smarter than this, I'm smarter than this. But I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. So I hid, and it just about killed me. By the time I finally got intervened on, my middle brother intervened on me, and he said, pack your bags, I'm going to have you committed today. And that just struck terror in me, because and it should have been a great thing. It should have been, wow, yay, great, I'm going to finally get some help. I can get this monster off my back and get the ball and chain out from my ankle, off my ankle. But instead my emotion was, oh my gosh, everybody is going to know what a horrible person I am, what an imposter I've been. They're going to know all these horrible, shameful things I've done. And I'd do anything not to have people know what a bad person I was. So it was a bad experience. It should have been a good experience, but that's because I thought I was bad. I thought I was stupid, bad, whatever word you want to put on it. But that's just not the case. And I'll tell you, had somebody taught me in high school, college, even medical school, anytime, had somebody taught me that, look, there's this disease, it's called addiction, it's very similar to diabetes in that if you watch Discovery Channel and find out from the symptoms that I must have diabetes, you go to the doctor, and the doctor sits down and says, okay, you got diabetes. Now what you have to do about this is you have to eat the right food at the right time and about the same amount of food every day, and you have to exercise every day, and probably you're going to have to take medicine, maybe not. But that's what diabetes is. It's just a disease of a deficiency of insulin. You either don't have enough insulin, or if you're a later onset diabetic, insulin doesn't work very well, but in any event, you have a deficiency of what insulin does. So you sit folks down, you say, this is your disease, you have a deficiency disease, this is what you do, and if you do all these things, you'll be fine. Now, if you pick and choose, if you do some but not others, it's going to get real ugly. You're going to start having limbs chopped off, your kidneys will fail, you'll be sitting in dialysis 3 or 4 times a week for 6 or 7 hours, you'll have early strokes, you'll go blind, you'll have heart attacks, and it's a bad disease. And I'm an internist by training. I've dealt with lots and lots of diabetics, and I can probably count on 2 hands the number of diabetics who've actually done what they've been told over the last, say, 20 years of my career. And that's why people know how bad a disease diabetes is, because we see the complications. You can't get people to do the things. But anyway, had somebody sat me down at some point and say, look, this is a disease, it's just like diabetes, it's just a deficiency, and if you figure out you've got it, you go someplace like Pavilion and you learn how to take care of it. And if you do that, you'll be fine, period. And I tell everybody who walks in my office that. I say, look, I absolutely guarantee you that if you do what we tell you, and then when you get out of here, if you work your recovery program, you will be fine. You will never, ever have to go back into that nightmare again. And people just look at me like, yeah, right, they don't believe me. But it's true. The problem is, just like with diabetics, people will pick and choose, and they'll do certain things but not others, and that's why the mortality rate of this disease is so high. That and the fact that there's so much stigma attached to it, so everybody wants to hide from it in the first place. Let me tell you a couple stories that sort of demonstrate this. When I was in treatment, my older brother came to visit me at one point, and I said to him as he was leaving, I said, Jim, I think Mom and Dad are alcoholic. What do you think? He looked me straight in the eye, and he said, oh no, they're not alcoholic. They get up every day and bathe and go to work. And I just looked at him, because he would probably still say that to me today, because he doesn't get it. He's been programmed by society to think that alcoholism is something dirty, something lazy. But you know, at the point he said that to me when I was in treatment, I had a successful medical practice. I was married. I had a big house on a lake, and I had a boat, and I bathed every day. And sometimes when I worked in the yard, I would even bathe twice. So, you know, it's not dirty. I wasn't a dirty person, but that was his take on that. And that's what a lot of people think. I'll tell you another story. A friend of mine who works at another treatment center tells a story about his children. Now, this is a fella who got sober before his children were born. He works with alcoholics. So anyway, he tells a story about his 2 little girls who go to a Catholic school. And he tells a story about getting a call one day from one of the nuns. And she calls and says, "Oh, Dr. So-and-so, I hate to tell you this, but your little girl," who at that point I think was maybe in the 2nd grade, "your little girl is running around telling everybody that you're an alcoholic." And he said, "Yeah, that's right, I am. She's right." And the nun said, "Yeah, but she's talking about it like it's asthma." And he said, "It is." And she said, "Okay then," and hung up the phone. Because you see, his little girls don't know there's anything to be ashamed of. They've grown up in a household where dad's an alcoholic, he works with alcoholics, they go to meetings with him, some of their friends are alcoholic. Mom goes to Al-Anon, they go to meetings with her, and they go to Alateen and Alababy and all those Ala things. So there's nothing unusual about it. There's nothing to be ashamed of. They've never been programmed, they've never been exposed to the sort of the negative stigma of this disease. So sure, they're talking about it in school. Your daddy's a fireman, my daddy's asthmatic, my daddy's alcoholic, you know, what's the big deal? They have no idea there's anything to be ashamed of. And the beauty of that is that if either one of those little girls ever blossoms with this disease, they're probably not going to die from it. And they're probably not going to lose years and years and years of their life trying to fight the monster. They're probably going to, you know, it's like watching TV and discovering you've got the symptoms of diabetes. They're going to sort of look around one day and go, "Wow, I've lost control of my alcohol use. This is just like Dad. I know what to do. I've got to go to a treatment center, learn how to take care of it, and then I'll be fine." As opposed to struggling and hiding and doing everything you can not to get caught or to hide this from your family. That kills people. So, you know, and I get the chills every time I tell that story, but that's the way it needs to be, because if all of society felt about alcoholism the way we feel about diabetes, a lot more people would survive this disease. There wouldn't be such a high death rate. And when I become queen of the world, I'm going to start RDS camps. You know, the neighborhood I grew up in was full of little kids, and a lot of the little kids who had diabetes or early asthma or something like that, they had to go to asthma or diabetes camp in the summer for about a week. And when I become the leader of the free world, I'm going to start RDS camps. And everybody who's got a family history of alcoholism or any type of addiction, any child will go to RDS camp for about a week. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't try to decide who has a family history and who doesn't. I would just send all children there, because all children need to be educated about it. Because, you know, if you look back at your family history and you're just looking for alcohol and drugs, you're going to miss a lot of this disease, because addiction can have any sort of a face. It can be sex addiction, relationship addiction, gambling, eating disorders, shopping, compulsive over anything. You can over-exercise, you can overwork, you can overdo anything. So the family history really gets tricky, but I think we ought to be sending the whole world to RDS camp and teaching them about this disease, so that it becomes like, my friend, you got diabetes, I got alcoholism, big deal. We both got a deficiency disease, we both have to learn to take care of it, period, end of story. So I think it starts with us talking about it as RDS, as a disease, and use the diabetes comparison. That's a good one. People understand that, they get that, to help them use that as an analogy. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but I feel strongly about that. Okay, the next thing is I want to show you where the reward pathway is. And it's important because my picture has got a line drawn through it that the handouts don't have. But the importance of this slide is that the line divides old brain and new brain. And the reward pathway is right down here. It's the little orange looking tadpole that is in the old brain. It's in the primitive brain. It's not in the new brain, okay? New brain's everything in front of the line, old brain's everything behind the line. Primitive brain, the most primitive areas in the very back, brain stem and back of the brain, those are the areas that beat your heart and make you take a breath. And it's not voluntary, it's not under your control, it's a reflex, it's something your brain does for you. Your old brain is really the hardwired part of your computer that keeps you alive, and you don't even have to think about it. You know, you don't have control over your heart rate or your breathing unless you're a master at yoga or meditation, and then you might be able to slow it down, but you cannot stop it. It's not under your control, it's automatic. Moving a little bit further forward towards the red line in the back of the brain is the limbic system. That's where the reward pathway is, okay? Now, the limbic system is the area that people think about when they think about primal drives, fight or flight, reproduction, hunger. Also a very, very primitive survival-oriented area. Little bit more control in this area, but not a lot, okay? And And then everything in front of this line is new brain, neocortex. That's the thinking brain. That's the part of the brain that makes us the highest form of life on Earth, supposedly. That's the part that designs space shuttles, works out nuclear physics, problem solving, right and wrong, that sort of thing. You know, if the reward pathway were in that new brain, the thinking brain, there wouldn't be such a disease, because you'd go, oh, cocaine? No way, not going to do that, it's dangerous. But it's not in that thinking part of the brain, it's in the primitive brain. And let me give you some other examples of what the primitive brain does so that you can understand the power of the primitive brain. You know, if you lean over and put your hand on a hot stove, you don't stand there and go, geez, I think I smell flesh burning. I wonder if my copay is going to have that copay or that copay. I wonder what I should do. There's no thought process at all. Your hand touches the stove and it jerks back up. That's primitive brain action. You don't even have to think about it. It happens automatically for you. Or if you're in a city and you step out in the street and you're about to get hit by one of these semi-trucks, you jerk back immediately. You don't think about it. You don't stand there and look at the truck and start contemplating or trying to figure out how many bones are going to be broken when it smushes you. You just jerk back. Again, that's what your primitive brain does for you. It's not under your thinking control. There's not even any communication with the thinking brain. It's automatic. Another good example that's probably the most important one that I always try to get people to remember has to do with drowning. You know, the way we know that people died by drowning is that on autopsy their lungs are full of water, right? Watch enough Crossing Jordan stuff, you know that kind of stuff. And so the question is, why would you ever have water in your lungs? Because we all know you can't breathe water, right? You cannot breathe water. I think you're born knowing that. But here's what happens. When you fall in the water and you've gotten to the point where you're exhausted enough that you can't even stay above the water, you're submerged, you're underwater, and you're holding your breath and holding your breath and holding your breath because you know that you cannot breathe water. Your thinking brain is screaming bloody murder saying, do not breathe, hold your breath or you're going to die. But at some point, your primitive brain kicks in and says, breathe. I will not let you hold your breath. It's against the law for the primitive brain. So in that instance, the primitive brain trumps the thinking brain. The thinking brain cannot overpower the primitive brain. You gasp, you fill your lungs with water, and that's the last thing you do. That's how powerful this primitive brain is. And some of y'all are probably already getting these thoughts like, I think I've seen my loved one do that. Snorting cocaine as the wife and children are driving away and the house is getting repossessed and that sort of thing. You know better, but your primitive brain is driving the boat here. So that's the power of the primitive brain. Now let me back up one more second, and I'm going to show you how this works. But the drug that you end up on, the drug that ends up becoming your primary drug, is determined by what you're missing, because the drugs of abuse replace or mimic the natural neurotransmitters. For instance, if you're primarily dopamine deficient and you're exposed to, this is assuming access, and you're exposed to it, your primary drug is going to be one of the stimulants. Now, stimulants are crystal meth, any of the cocaine forms, whether it's powdered cocaine or crack, and it's almost any of the ADD drugs, Ritalin, Concerta, Adderall, Focalin, there's a lot of them, so I can't name them all, but And the reason is those drugs in that stimulant class stimulate dopamine release a lot. They don't go through any side steps. It's a direct boost of dopamine in your brain. Now, if you're primarily GABA deficient, remember that's the sedating anti-anxiety neurotransmitter. If you're primarily GABA deficient, then you're probably going to become dependent on the class of drugs we used to call tranquilizers, now sedative hypnotics. And the biggest group of drugs within that class are the benzodiazepines. That's Valium, Xanax, Ativan, Klonopin, Temazepam, Restoril. And then there's the non-benzos like Ambien, sleeping pill, Lunesta, the butterfly, Prosom, there's several of those. And then another class, again within that sedative group, would be barbiturates. We don't see quite as much of those anymore with two exceptions. One is Soma, which is marketed and prescribed as a muscle relaxer, but it is no such thing. It's just a barbiturate. It relaxes your brain, not your muscles. And then the other would be a headache medicine called Fiorset or Fiorinol. It's also marketed as Esgic, G1, Metagesic. It's got a lot of different names, but it's butalbital, which is a barbiturate, again, typically given for tension headaches. All of the drugs in that sedative class stimulate GABA, so that if you're normally anxious, you're not going to be anxious anymore. Now, if you're serotonin deficient, statistically, you're most likely to become dependent on pot or one of the cannabis products. And if you're endorphin deficient, if that's your primary deficiency, then you're probably going to become opiate dependent. And you know, opiates are heroin, morphine, Demerol, codeine, hydrocodone, oxycodone, OxyContin, Vicodin, Lortabs, fentanyl, tramadol, Darvocet. There's thousands of them, but those are a few. Because again, drugs in that opiate class directly stimulate endorphin release. So if you're endorphin deficient, that's going to make you feel normal or give you energy. Now, you may realize that I've skipped one big group, and that's the alcoholics. Alcoholics are deficient in all of those neurotransmitters to different degrees. And you know, the thing that we now know is that alcoholism is not just one disease. I think so far we're up to about 10 different locations on the human genome that code for a predisposition to alcoholism. You know, because again, as I said, there's more than one disease of alcoholism. There's the early onset alcoholic, and that's somebody who starts drinking in their teenage years. They typically have a very strong family history. You can see it easily, father, grandfather, brothers. Those folks have got more problems in their endorphin and dopamine neurotransmitter systems, whereas the later onset alcoholics, those are folks who can drink socially for many, many years, and then in their, say, late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s, they begin to drink alcoholically. That's where people say, oh, you drank too much and caused yourself to have alcoholism. That's not the case. It's a totally different neurotransmitter problem, different genetic link. Then you also have the alcoholic who does nothing but alcohol despite having tried everything else, but that's the only thing they want. That's the only thing that they will use. I've got a friend who says, look, I'd trade you a kilo of cocaine for a fifth of vodka and be convinced I got the best end of the deal, because his brain is not missing what cocaine replaces. So it does nothing for him. But then you may have another alcoholic who's addicted to alcohol and cocaine or alcohol and heroin. Those are all different diseases based on what's missing or deficient in your brain. Okay? Now, I want to see if I can bring this together and show you on the board what happens when somebody who is born with a deficiency that we've talked about encounters drugs of abuse and begins to use them. And the way I like to do this is using numbers. We're going to use a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being normal, okay? So if 10's normal, the person that we're going to use as an example, we're going to say is an 8, okay? That person is dopamine deficient, because I like to use stimulants for this example. Well, we could pick anything, but we'll use stimulants. So we've got a person who's walking around the planet, they've been dopamine deficient all of their lives. They go to a party one day and somebody says, here, try this, and they smoke crack. The reason I like to use crack or crystal meth is because these smoked drugs like this hit your brain within about 8 seconds. And they just give you this mushroom cloud of dopamine because it's such a powerful effect. So essentially what's happening is that you just blossom in your brain with all this dopamine. Now, your brain, as I said, your primitive brain's primary job is survival, to keep you alive. And it knows that too much dopamine can kill you. Too much dopamine causes something called that causes malignant hyperthermia. That's where your temperature goes up to 110, 112, 113, and you can't survive that. That's not compatible with life. Now, your primitive brain knows that, so when it sees this much dopamine floating around, it does two things to try to adapt to the situation to keep you alive. And in fact, it's called neuroadaptation. Now remember, this person's born with a different brain. They're born an 8, not a 10. When they start using the drug, they cause permanent changes. These are these neuroadaptive changes. And for the most part, it's two things. One is the primitive brain cuts down your sensitivity to dopamine so that if you shower it again with this much dopamine, maybe it won't kill you. Okay? And it can do that in a lot of ways. It can cut down the number of receptors, the number of transporter molecules. There's all sorts of ways it can do that. So that's the sensitivity. The second thing is it cuts down your own production of dopamine. And that's just like being in a room like this. If you've got, in your den, say, if you've got your central air thermostat on one wall, but on the other wall you put a window unit air conditioner, you know if you run your window unit all summer, your central air is going to assume that the job's being done for it and it won't come on. The rest of your house will be hot. And that's essentially the same thing that's happening here. When it sees this much dopamine floating around, your primitive brain starts cutting back your own dopamine production. So this person born an 8, a little bit later is going to be walking around as a 6 because production got cut back. But they have met the crack dealer. They know the secret of life. So they go back and they get more crack, and they might smoke half again as much the second time, but they only get a 6, not an 8, because they're less sensitive. You know, it used to take 2 drinks, now it takes 6 or 4. So this goes on. A little bit later, because production got cut back, this person who was a 6 is now a 4, because 12 is still too much dopamine, right? Now here's the deal. If you're born an 8 and now you're a 4, you're no longer using cocaine because it's fun. You're using it because you can't function without it. Because again, this is happening in the reward pathway, all right? And the reward pathway is not filler material. You have to have it to survive. You absolutely have to have it. So if you're born an 8, walking around a 4, you can't function. You can't put one foot in front of the other. You can't carry out your normal activities. So this is when the ball and chain gets hooked around your ankle. Now you're going out and finding more cocaine because you have to function. So this person goes out and this time might smoke twice as much crack, but they only get a 4 because they're getting less and less sensitive to it. So you can see where I'm going. Whoops. Then you come to a place like Pavilion and you don't get any drug of abuse, okay? And when people walk into a place like Pavilion, to a detox unit, in this situation right here, they are very, very sick brains. They may be physically sick, where they're vomiting, having diarrhea, seizures, that sort of thing, or if they're a stimulant-dependent person, they just can't think, they can't function. But those are very, very sick brains who come in to Pavilion or to any detox unit at this stage. This is a person that's just about to die, not doing well at all. Now, my mother looked at me right before I went to treatment and said, "Why do you keep doing this if you know it's killing you? You can see what's happening." And the reason she said that is because she could see this top line. She was watching this happen. She was watching my life fall apart, as most of you have watched your own lives or your family's lives fall apart. But I couldn't see it, and I didn't know how to answer her question. But here's the answer to this. Here's probably the most important part of this lecture. The reason we keep doing the things we do, even though they don't make sense and they're killing us, is because this is happening in the reward pathway, right? Primitive part of the brain. And the reward pathway is sensing a dopamine deficiency developing, as you can see from the numbers. And when it sees that kind of a deficiency developing, it starts screaming at you, saying, "Warning, warning, warning, dopamine deficiency developing, gonna die if you don't do something." So the message the drug addict or dependent person senses is, got to use. You get this gut level urge to go out and find the cocaine or whatever drug you're on. And it's not an articulate thought. You don't wake up one day and go, "Geez, I think I'll become a drug addict when I grow up and ruin my life and everybody else's." The thinking brain is not at all tapping into this. It's not a part of this. This is primitive brain, again, giving you this gut level sensation that literally is a survival instinct. But it's go find it or things are not going to be okay. Does that make sense? This is the same powerful primitive brain that when you're underwater and you better not gasp, because if you do, it'll kill you. This is the same primitive brain that gives you that message and then makes you gasp. That's how powerful these urges are, okay? And every once in a while we wake up and go, "Wow, something's not right with this picture, I got to stop." And the person stops for a few days or a few weeks, and then you're right back to it because the primitive brain is still screaming bloody murder. Okay, does that make sense? All right. Now, there's good news and bad news here. The good news is you will get back from the 1 or whatever you were when you got to treatment to your 8, okay? You will get back to that. The bad news is you'll never be a 10. And the way I describe this is I tell folks I was born with blue eyes, I'm going to die with blue eyes. I don't have the genetic machinery to have brown eyes like my brothers, nor do I have the genetic machinery to be a 10. I'll never have that. I'm going to live and die in 8, meaning I hope I die in recovery. The good news about that is 8 doesn't have to feel bad. Most of us grew up feeling like there's this hole in our soul that the wind blows through, and you're always trying to do something to feel better, to feel normal, to feel something different. In recovery, if you work a recovery program with all your heart and soul, 8 doesn't feel bad. It feels more like a 10 on most days. And you're taught things to do to keep you in that shape. So the deal is that you're an 8, you have this disease. It's not that you just ignore it and get better, but you learn how to deal with it the same way a diabetic learns how to treat their diabetes, and then they can feel okay. On any given day, if I'm feeling like murdering somebody who probably needs to be murdered, right? But if I'm feeling like murdering somebody, I'm restless, irritable, and discontent, I'm ragey, I'm easily angered, If I go to a meeting, a 12-step meeting for me, which is AA, I'm going to come out feeling less like an 8, more like a 10, because even if I don't say anything, I'm going to feel better. And I used to just say, well, it's magic, it works, it really does. It's not really magic. 12-step meetings are cognitive behavioral therapy, and research has shown that that really does literally rewire your brain. So there is a scientific basis, but for the most part, I'd just like to tell you that it really works. 8 no longer feels abnormal. The more you work your program, the better you feel as an 8, the more comfortable in your skin you are. The less you work it, the more miserable you are. And here's the other thing that's important. People talk about self-medicating. We really are self-medicating. Alcohol or drugs have been, the coping mechanism have been the solution for many, many years, but the solutions now become the problem. So you have to find another solution, because if you just take the alcohol away from this person who's an 8, you're going to leave one very miserable little person on the earth. You have to give them something else. And the 12-step programs, the recovery programs, are that something else, right? Because the solution you had no longer works. The solution now is the 12-step program, but it really does work. And so that's the good news. Now, the other thing about this to be aware of is that this period of time to get from the 1 back to the 8, or whatever you were born with, is called PAWS, post-acute withdrawal syndrome, okay? And that can be anywhere from 6 to 12 to 18 months, depending on what drug you used, how long you used it, how old you are, all sorts of variables. So I can't give you a number for a drug or a person. But this in general lasts 6 to 12 to 18 months. And it has a very specific set of symptoms. People don't sleep well. And that's a really big one, because lack of sleep there's a direct relationship between poor sleep, lack of sleep, and relapse. So here at Pavilion, we treat it very aggressively. We start holistically with meditation tapes, relaxation CDs, all sorts of things like that. Melatonin, which is a health food product, and if that doesn't work, we go to sleep medications. They are non-brain rewarding, what people used to say mood altering, non-brain rewarding medications. There's no danger of becoming addicted to these drugs. But we do treat sleep aggressively, because if you don't sleep, you're probably not going to be able to stay sober. Other symptoms of PAWS are you're very much more stress sensitive, and you already don't have a very good stress response system, so you're more stress sensitive. You're emotionally labile. You're either as numb as you can be, or your emotions are all over the place, just off the deep end. You're accident prone. You're clumsier than you normally would be. Everybody looks like they've got ADD. Their attention span is about that of a 5-year-old, right? Remember that? It's about that of a 5-year-old, and your concentration is also, it's really poor, and your short-term memory is just gone. I tell people you've got to take notes, you've got to have a PDF, you've got to do something to make lists of things, because you will never remember these things. So it's a fairly distinct set of symptoms, and the problem is any stress makes all the PAWS symptoms worse. And there's a really good chapter in Terry Gorski's Living Sober book about PAWS that I'd strongly recommend. So any stress makes it worse. So one of the things that we tell clients when they first get out of treatment is keep the stress level to a minimum. Don't rock the boat. Don't get out of a marriage. Don't get in a relationship. Don't move. Don't change jobs. Try to keep things as stable as they are, as you can. Because if you put yourself in real stressful situations, all the PAWS symptoms get worse. And as PAWS symptoms get worse, you get more frustrated, you get more stressed, then you get more PAWS symptoms, and it really can contribute to relapse. The other thing about this period of time when you're in these PAWS symptoms, the post-acute withdrawal symptoms, is that that's probably the chance, the time period when you have the highest chance of relapse. You're born with this disease, you'll die with it, and so you can relapse anytime between now and when you die. But statistically, you're most likely to do it in here, during your first 6 to 12 to 18 months. And part of the reason is you've got this little structure in your brain called an amygdala. Now, the amygdala's job is to associate either fear or pleasure with what gave it to you, okay? And it's directly connected into the reward pathway, and it's a very, very strong connection. For instance, they did a study with a group of recovering cocaine addicts. These were guys who smoked crack, and they'd been in recovery, I think, a minimum of about 3 years. And they put them in PET scanners. PET scanners are like a CT scan or an MRI that they can see different parts of your brain in color, and based on metabolic activity, they can sort of tell one area is really active. Well, they put these guys who had been in recovery from crack in PET scanners, and they put screens in front of them and started showing them just random pictures, puppies, flowers, whatever. But then all of a sudden, they flashed up a picture of a crack pipe. And what they saw on the PET scan is that the reward pathway just lit up like a Christmas tree. You know, for instance, these guys who had gotten themselves back, let's just say, to an 8, because they'd been in recovery for a while, when they saw the crack pipe, this happened. They got a squirt of dopamine about equal to that. Now, the reason that happened, they weren't touching the drug, they weren't smoking anything, but the amygdala, which is what I mentioned to you, sees the crack pipe and knows that within seconds you're going to be lighting up and smoking crack, and it knows what's going to happen. That's its whole job. Again, it's an emotional memory. It's pleasure, and it associates it with what gave it to you. So the amygdala sees the crack pipe, directly stimulates the reward pathway, as if you just smoked crack. Now, if you set the cascade off, if you don't stop it by doing certain things that I'll tell you about in a second, if you don't stop it quickly, it's like a ball rolling downhill. It's gonna get set off. And sure enough, these guys a few days later in the study were reporting cravings, because this is what happened. They went from an 8 probably down to a 4, meaning their cascade got set off, right? Now, if you've been in recovery a while, you know what a craving is. You know exactly what it feels like. You know, some people get all the way through treatment and never have felt a craving, so they don't even know what it feels like, and they may be scared like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be feeling that. I don't want to tell anybody. Well, if you're in recovery, you know what a craving is, and you also know that if you're starting to crave, that you are really sitting in a big red danger zone. And there's certain things you can do, and you better do it fast. They talk about, in AA, they talk about lead time being minutes to hours. And what that means is when you feel the craving, when you're aware that you're craving, you do these things to sort of save yourself and stop the cascade. The first thing you do is you pick up the phone and you call your sponsor. And if you can't find your sponsor, you call the next 10 people on your phone list. If you can't find them, you go to a meeting. If you can't find a meeting, you go to a clubhouse, and on and on. There's a whole series of things that you're taught. This is sort of your bag of safety tools in 12-step programs. But and these guys were fine with that. And I don't think anybody relapsed as a result of that study. They knew what to do. But you've got to stop it quickly, because once the cascade really takes off and running, the primitive brain is then in control. And we all know from what I've told you how powerful that primitive brain is. It can literally kill you underwater, just like it can with drugs. So you've got to stop this process. Now, in folks in early recovery who may be right in here, they may have left treatment and they haven't gotten a sponsor yet because they're afraid they'll pick the wrong one. Or they haven't gotten a meeting list yet. They haven't found all the meetings in the area, so they don't know where to go. Or they haven't gotten all the phone numbers they need to get yet because, oh, Dr. Holman, you don't understand. I'm on the phone all day at work. I can't call people at night. You know, they just haven't quite gotten around to it, and they're still thinking they're different. I was told one time early in my recovery that the people who die of this disease die because they think they're different. And I almost fell out of my chair when I heard that, because that is so true. I was beginning to do those things myself early on. But in any event, folks early in recovery have probably not gotten themselves quite into the program, because again, I hate to say this, but more often than not, people don't do what you tell them. They'll do this, but not that. You know, I'll go to meetings, but I'm not getting a sponsor. I'm not telling anybody my secrets. I'm a private person. Or I'll go to meetings, but I'm not going to get phone numbers and make phone calls. I just can't do that. So people pick and choose, just like diabetics, what they're going to do. So if you're early in recovery and you get triggered, but you don't have a sponsor to call, you don't have a phone list, you don't know where the meetings are, you're going to relapse. Because again, this ball starts rolling, you don't know how to stop it, you're going down, you're going to relapse. So when people are in this early stage of recovery, we teach them, you've got to change playmates and playgrounds. You cannot go around people, places, things, or situations that remind you of drinking or using. Because if you do, your amygdala will give you that shot of dopamine or GABA or whatever, and it's liable to cause a relapse. And some people just don't believe us enough about that. But just like the guys in the PET scans who saw the crack pipes, you know, I tell folks, look, you can't drive by the liquor store every day on the way to work. I don't care if you've got to drive 20 miles out of the way. You need to do that. Because any one time driving by the liquor store, you're not going to get struck drunk, but you're going to get a little ding of dopamine. This tends to be a cumulative effect. One day you're drinking alcohol and you think, wow, well, how did that happen? Well, it's because you got dinged so many times. And it finally set off the reward pathway. Or like the guy who came to me a few years ago and said, this is a late 50s CEO, very bright, highly motivated kind of guy, says, geez, Dr. Holman, I got it. I'm never going to drink again, which is the first warning sign, because if you know you're never going to drink again, why would you work a recovery program? Because this is really hard work. So this guy was overly confident. He thought he was smart. And he said to me, so I got it, Dr. Holman, I'm not going to drink again, but I got to tell you, I'm not doing that aftercare stuff because my wife made reservations on a cruise line about a year ago, and I'm not letting her down. I've let her down enough. So see, that's somebody saying, I'm too ashamed to take care of myself. I've let her down. This guy's got too much shame. He'd rather do something for his wife because he's so ashamed than take care of his disease. He says, but anyway, so she made this reservation on a cruise line. It leaves the day after I leave Pavilion, and I'm going on it. I said, oh, that's not a good idea. Sure enough, that guy was drunk within a week. Because, on cruise ships, people are drinking all the time. So this poor guy, who's very bright, very motivated, got a lot to lose if he relapses again, is sitting around on a boat, and his amygdala is like this Navy scanner, this Navy radar thing, watching everybody else drink. And it's just dinging him over and over and over. So of course he drank. But he thought he could outsmart it. And that's just not going to be the case. And that's why it's so important to remember that your amygdala is always going to be there. It's always going to be looking around, sensing what's in your environment. And your triggers might be sight, like a crack pipe. It might be smell, the smell of pot, the smell of alcohol. It might be something you hear. It might be something you see. But in early recovery, you've got to stay away from people, places, things, and situations that remind you meaning your amygdala, of drinking or using. Because if you don't, you're probably going to relapse. Doesn't matter how smart you are or how motivated you are. You've got something in your primitive brain in there that's going to do this to you, unless you protect it. Does that make sense so far? Okay. All right, that's also the reason that, we tell people, get all the wine glasses out of your house, get all the highballs out of your house, get the booze out of your house. You can't see it. You shouldn't be seeing it. You shouldn't go to restaurants that serve alcohol. It's not okay. It will be okay later. The main point of recovery is not to be hindered by your disease, but the first year or so, you have to avoid at all costs anything that reminds you of drinking or using. Break the champagne glasses, break the wine glasses. Don't drink O'Doul's. O'Doul's does have some alcohol in it. But I think, personally, the bigger part of the problem is that it's in a beer bottle. So your amygdala is just going doing, doing, doing because it says beer bottle, beer bottle. And eventually you're probably going to drink or use something else. Okay? The last thing I want to talk about has to do with cross-addiction. Cross-addiction is where somebody, say, who's addicted to alcohol later relapses, let's just say on heroin or pot or something else. That's cross-addiction, meaning you're addicted to a whole different class of drugs. And it's important to understand about this because a lot of people think they're safe from one class of drugs just because it wasn't their primary drug. For instance, I've had plenty of people say, oh, Dr. Holman, don't worry about it. I can take that Vicodin or whatever the dentist is going to give me because I'm an alcohol person. I've never been a pill person. I have to say, no, that's not right. And to make this make sense, you have to see the last slide in the handout. And what that shows is that dopamine is the final common chemical in the reward pathway. Serotonin, GABA, and endorphins all modulate dopamine release. So it doesn't matter if your initial addiction was to an opiate so that you got to dopamine through endorphins. If you think it's okay to take anything that stimulates GABA or any of the others, you can still become addicted to it. So you're not safe from any other brain-rewarding drug just because that was not part of your primary drug or not in the class of your primary drug, and that's super important to understand that. And I think that little box in your handout makes that point. A lot of people relapse on something other than their drug of choice. In the primitive brain, once it gets in charge, you may be relapsing on, say, pot when your drug of choice was heroin, but eventually your primitive brain knows what really does it, and you will eventually get back to what was your primary drug again. But that's not uncommon for people to relapse on something other than their primary drug, so you have to understand that, and don't assume that you're safe from one drug just because it wasn't your primary drug. Okay? And that's about it, but let me just tell you a couple more things real quickly before we stop. I get the question a lot of times, people say, well, look, why don't you just give everybody a dopamine pill and let's get rid of this disease? And there's several answers to that. One is there's never going to be a pill that'll fix this disease. I just don't think there will ever be such a thing because this is a spiritual, mental, physical, emotional disease. It's not, what I'm talking about in this lecture is just the barest, smallest essence of the brain chemistry of this disease. But it's a soul sickness. It's not something that a pill is ever going to completely fix. But the other part of the answer to that question is you can't deliver dopamine selectively to the reward pathway without showering the whole the whole brain, with dopamine. And too much dopamine will kill you. As I've said before, it causes that malignant hyperthermia. So there's not a way to selectively deliver it just to one area. It's one of the reasons that makes Parkinson's disease so hard to treat, because it is so hard to get dopamine right where you need it. And it's not treated very successfully most of the time. Another question that I get asked a lot is, well, why isn't Paxil or Prozac or any of the serotonin type antidepressants, why are they not addictive? And the answer is, depression is a lot more complicated than just serotonin. There's a lot of other neurotransmitters involved. And for the most part, the problem is occurring in a different area of the brain. So when we give somebody Prozac or Paxil or Zoloft, it'll have a little effect on the reward pathway, but it will not cure the disease. It will not cure any cravings. It's treating a problem in a different area of the brain. The levels and doses that we give for depression would never do anything to the reward pathway. I think even if you took 100 Zoloft, it's never going to affect the reward pathway. So they are not brain-altering drugs in the sense of setting off this cascade. I don't like to use the term mood-altering anymore because Prozac's mood-altering, as is heroin. But brain rewarding, meaning it sets off the cascade in the reward pathway, is what's important. And those are not brain rewarding drugs. Okay. Do y'all have any questions? Thanks. Appreciate your attention.